Hello, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Merriweather and Tharp. And we are, you already know how to say it, go for 2 in 22. And we are now just a couple of days away from being in Los Angeles and setting the stage for the national championship against TCU. I'm so excited. I'm so ready to get there. I'm ready to kind of cover this game from every possible angle. We'll do some of that here in our home studio before we leave our DawgNation World Headquarters studio. We'll do a lot of that from Los Angeles. We're going to pretty much be live throughout the weekend here. Anytime a Georgia player speaks, we're going to try to give you coverage of that. Obviously leading into a Monday with the show live from Los Angeles. I will tell you that we are going to pre-record tomorrow's show. We're going to pre-record it here this afternoon to air tomorrow. I have to fly in the morning. I just couldn't help it. So that's going to kind of preempt our normal schedule time. So we're going to do a show this afternoon. I think it will be a good one to set the stage for tomorrow. We'll talk more about that here coming up. And we got some really fun and special surprises in store for the weekend that's on its way. So we're going to try to give you every angle. Georgia, TCU. How do you win? How do you take that step towards winning a second straight national championship? Terence Edwards will help us with this today. There's also some weird news coming out of this national championship game a little bit. We're going to try to cover that. Some of this is actually coming from the TCU side of things. So we'll see if we can deal with some of that. And listen, we're just going to have fun with it. Very rarely in life does it work out for your team the way that it has over the course of these last 2 seasons. And it all culminates, at least for this band of Bulldogs, on Monday in L.A. So let's continue the preview. UGA, TCU, go for 2 in 22, national championship on the line. Let's talk about it right now as DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So I'm going to go ahead and tell you that I believe that the build-up to the Georgia-TCU game, even though it's a much shorter build-up than the Peach Bowl was, the build-up to the Georgia-TCU game is actually, for me, a little bit more comfortable than the build-up to Georgia-Ohio State was. People are just sort of wired a certain way. I am definitely wired in such a way that I am just a natural contrarian. When everybody thinks one thing, I have a tendency to be obsessed with the other side of that. And the contrarian point of view, the opposite point of view of the prevailing wisdom, is not always correct, but I think it's always a pretty good place to start, I believe. That's just the way that some of us are wired. I'm kind of wired that way. And I definitely thought going into the Georgia-Ohio State game, the Peach Bowl that we saw on Saturday night, and a lot of you heard me say this, I definitely thought there was a little bit too much love for Georgia and a little bit too much of an undervaluing of Ohio State simply on the basis that Ohio State had lost its most recent game to Michigan. And over the course of the season, you just sort of see that happen. The teams that are winning keep being built up, and maybe eventually to a point in which it doesn't reflect, reality. And when a team loses, they are just absolutely trashed, absolutely, kind of kicked to the curb. And Ohio State was probably done that after the Michigan game once again in a way that kind of doesn't really reflect reality. Well, all of a sudden, Georgia won that game, of course, but maybe did not do it in the sort of sterling fashion with the way that Georgia's been winning games all year long. Even though it was a thrilling win, it probably wasn't a pristine win from the standpoint that Georgia gave up 41 points and needed every bit of its 42 points offensively just to win that game. So even though Georgia's going to hear a little bit more criticism this week than it's maybe kind of heard going into the Peach Bowl, there is a part of me as a Georgia fan and as someone who sort of talks about this for a living that's kind of comfortable with that, kind of comfortable with the idea here with Georgia looking for one more opportunity to dig deep and find something about itself in this final game of the season. They do so especially on defense with the notion of, hey, we don't want to go out playing like we have these last couple of games. Sort of second half performance defensively against LSU. Tigers scored 30 points there, 41 points given up against Ohio State, and for a while it looked like Ohio State might even get more than that. We don't want to go out that way. We want to come out and show the world that we're better than what we've put on display. And after what we've seen from Georgia these last couple of seasons, or what we've seen from Georgia throughout the entirety of the Kirby Smart era, does anybody doubt Georgia's ability to do that? Does anybody doubt that Georgia will have a much better showing defensively against TCU than it had against Ohio State, that it's just time for Georgia to get back to looking like Georgia again defensively. I certainly wouldn't doubt that, and I think that anybody who does is potentially making a very big mistake. And thus far, we haven't heard a lot from UGA since it left Atlanta the other night, but we have heard some. And I think the chatter is kind of what you would hope it would be, maybe even what you would expect it to be, about an extra level of focus, not just to win the national championship, and ultimately that's all that really matters, but to do so in a way that shows just how well Georgia can actually play. In fact, Javon Bullard, who I thought was such an important player for Georgia on Saturday night, and a guy who's been unbelievably important to Georgia all season long, he really articulated that message very well on that conference call thing that we talked about yesterday that happened a little earlier this week. Bullard on the notion that you better believe, not only does Georgia believe it can play better, it actually expects to play better when we tune in from Los Angeles on Monday night. This is Bullard on that topic from earlier this week.
I think the whole team can attest that we didn't play our best game, but at the end of the day, it's only one result that matters. That matters the most, and that's the W. So, like I said, we didn't play our best game, but it's a whole lot we can fix as far as I can speak on the defensive side of the ball, communication and things like that. Just the basic things like that, knowing your leverage, talking. I know we got to talk better throughout the secondary and things like that. So, like I said, throughout this week, we're just going to work on the smaller things and try to detail our work to the best of our ability.
So I like that from Bullard. He starts off by saying, yeah, you better believe we think we can play better, we want to. Then he gets into some of the nuts and bolts of how that happens, maybe better communication with the secondary. Obviously, we've seen that group kind of picked on here a little bit, certainly against a terrific collection of Ohio State wide receivers. That was an issue, and we would say that the TCU wide receivers, certainly in the case of Johnson, they're very, very good as well. And so, therefore, once again, this group's going to kind of be on the spotlight. But beyond that, the other day, I saw an interview with Greg McElroy. McElroy's the ESPN analyst, obviously played at Alabama, but now he's essentially an ESPN analyst. We talk about McElroy from time to time because sometimes he has some interesting things to say. And right there, actually, while he was still in Atlanta, this was from on the field there at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, McElroy kind of already pivoting for Georgia against TCU in the national championship. And on a day in which we say, hey, we think the Georgia defense will play better, they need to play better, McElroy, when he was on ESPN the other day, actually cited sort of a specific thing about TCU that might make that a little bit of a challenge. Something you need to understand about this quarterback, Max Duggan, for the Horned Frogs, that's maybe a little bit different than the quarterback, C.J. Stroud, that you just did battle with from Ohio State. I think this is actually pretty interesting from Greg McElroy about what better might mean for Georgia against TCU. This is from ESPN. This is Greg McElroy.
Well, I think that there's a lot of things that Georgia needs to clean up. For instance, the way they rushed the passer tonight, they oftentimes rushed with really a kind of out of control, frankly, which allowed C.J. Stroud plenty of time to make a guy miss and then extend plays. Well, C.J. Stroud's a decent runner. He's not an elite runner. Max Duggan, when he's at his best, can really make you miss and create with his own legs. So I think Georgia's going to have to be a lot more conservative with how they rush the passer.
So, listen, I'm not an X's and O's expert. McElroy played the sport, so he probably knows more about this than I do. But I don't agree with his assessment right there. I mean, I do probably agree with his assessment that I do believe that Duggan's a better runner, certainly proven over the course of the season than C.J. Stroud is. Stroud was amazing the other night. Duggan's been better over the course of the year. I mean, I think there are a lot of games which he'll have like 15 carries. I mean, he's essentially a big part of their rushing attack just with his own legs there. So I do think that he's right in his evaluation of Duggan as a player. But I don't believe he is correct, at least I hope he's not, in terms of his diagnosis of the UGA defense. You know, I don't think you can simply say, well, because he can run, we're therefore going to be more conservative with our pass rush. I don't think that works for Georgia. I really don't. And in a night against Ohio State in which Georgia wasn't great defensively, it still found a way to get 4 sacks. And if any one of those 4 sacks don't occur, how much different is the complexion of that game, at least potentially speaking? And so I understand that McElroy's larger point's probably correct, that you have to be a little more careful with a guy like Duggan at quarterback. But I don't think careful equals conservative here in this spot, because I just don't think that's the best version of Georgia. I think when you ask those Georgia wide receivers to cover, or I should say those Georgia defensive backs to cover for a long time, they got you in trouble against Ohio State. And you certainly don't want to leave those guys out there on an island too much against TCU. Now, I would also say the flip side here for a moment, that if you're going to say that Duggan is a better runner than Stroud over the course of the year, then you might also say that Duggan as a passer is a little bit less accomplished than Stroud is. Stroud's I think 9.5 yards per attempt on the season. That's right there alongside Hendon Hooker for best in the country. Duggan's not too far behind that, but he is right down there. He's actually tied with Stetson Bennett at 8.9 yards per attempt. So this is a guy that's just slightly below the passing prowess of C.J. Stroud, but possibly better from a running standpoint than what Stroud's brought to the table. And it also kind of sort of speaks to a little bit about what's different about the TCU offense overall, that some of the success that Duggan has had through the air this year has come not from the big, pretty deep throws like, what's maybe somewhat C.J. Stroud did or certainly what Bryce Young did a year ago. Some of this is just making an opportunity for TCU guys with the ball in their hand to make a man miss, to get those yards after the catch. That was a big part of what Johnston did against Michigan, and it's a big part of what this TCU offense has been doing all year long. In fact, Kirby Smart talked more about that when he was a part of that conference call a little earlier this week. This is Smart's assessment of all of the kind of short throws, behind the line of scrimmage stuff, open field type stuff that TCU's trying to create offensively. This is what Smart said about that.
Well, I think all of college football is that way. More of the game is played on the perimeter. It's not unique to just TCU. They also throw the ball vertical down the field, and they have a lot of size outside. So they can cover you up on the perimeter game, and they can launch shots, and they've hit a ton of big plays throughout this year.
So that's a pretty interesting assessment there from Kirby Smart there on that, which, listen, I would think you would say, well, if that's the challenge here for Georgia, hey, charging after the football and making sure you're sound when it comes to making tackling. Isn't that kind of what Georgia does? Isn't that kind of what Georgia has been doing all season long? And if it's more of that kind of stuff against TCU, then I think the hope here would be, well, that actually kind of plays into the hands of the Dogs, maybe a little bit more than some of the pre-snap stuff to kind of get a defensive secondary confused that maybe Ohio State was all about when you go back to Saturday night. But then possibly the biggest issue of all, and this is not just an issue that plagues Georgia, this is potentially an issue that plagues both teams, is we're not talking about a 15th game. And I think it's interesting that both of these teams come into this game having emerged from shootouts in the national semifinals. We typically haven't seen this kind of situation where both teams played one of these combined 100-point wild affairs, and yet both TCU and Georgia did that. We don't really care about the TCU side of this, but as far as the Georgia side of this goes, having been in a high-scoring game, having played a lot of snaps, is there concern right now that Georgia might just be a little bit fatigued trying to get back and do all of this again on a Monday night, just 9 days after the previous game? Smart this week also talked about maybe how tired his defense is right now and how the current way in which college football is played contributes to that possible fatigue. Once again, here is Kirby Smart.
I don't know how to pinpoint it. I don't know. Traditionally, the teams that are in these games are, they're pretty good offensively, but you'd like to say they're also pretty good defensively. But I think the studies and numbers indicate that as the season goes on, and especially these semifinal and final games, scoring has to be going up. What that is, I can't really pinpoint it. I don't know that I would say it was just being tired, because you could say that's relative to offense as well, that you can get tired on offense, you can get tired on defense. But I certainly think it's hard to play quality defense anymore, because I know we try really hard here, and I know they do at TCU as well. Joe Gillespie does an unbelievable job, their defensive coordinator, and it just seems that tackling becomes worse as the season goes on, and there's more scoring. But I don't know why that is. I've been a part of some unique national championships with the LSU-Alabama ones in the rematch that was lower scoring, but outside of that, I've been a part of a lot of shootouts.
Quick aside here, Kirby mentions the name Joe Gillespie. That's the TCU defensive coordinator. This really is true. Gillespie is viewed as kind of a rising star in the coaching ranks. This is his first year with the Horned Frogs, his first year coaching staff. I believe he came over, and some of y'all may know this better than me. I think he came over from Tulsa. Is that right? He was defensive coordinator at Tulsa before coming over to TCU, and you've heard a lot of good things about that unit here this year. Statistically, it doesn't necessarily show up maybe the way you expect a great defense to, but there have been a couple of key moments in which defense really helped TCU this season. Texas game, for instance, they probably played very good defense against a pretty good Longhorn offense. Gillespie really is kind of a name to know. So just kind of an aside there is that in future years, you're going to hear a lot more about Gillespie probably if he continues on the same trajectory. And that's a guy that's going to be drawing some stuff up against Georgia there for Monday night. But beyond that, the idea of these high-scoring games that we sometimes see in the college football playoff, I don't mind telling you this. I do believe that Georgia plays much better defensively on Monday. And as someone who just desperately wants Georgia to win the game somehow, some way, I think the best way for the Georgia defense to aid this offense, or should I say they aid the team's chances of winning, just in total, I think the best way for the defense to make a great contribution in this game on Monday, or maybe better said, the best way to measure the contribution the defense does make is I certainly hope this game from a combined standpoint is nowhere near as high scoring as the Saturday night game was. For those of you that care about the gambling part of this, there's the over-under where you add the 2-point totals of the two teams, and you can bet, do you think it exceeds that total or goes underneath that total? Historically, the last couple of years, Georgia's obviously been a pretty easy under pick, and the totals have been going down for Georgia to try to match the way in which Georgia, especially when it wins against Power 5 competition, has just been kind of a rubber stamp under. A lot of times that's been the case. But the Georgia-Ohio State total was much higher projected than that, and then it sailed way past that. The projected total was somewhere around, 62, 63, I forget the exact number, but it was somewhere in that kind of low 60s number, and ultimately the game exceeded that by a wide margin. Well, once again, this Georgia-TCU over-under is once again somewhere around that kind of low 60s. And I don't mind telling you, I don't think this game needs to be in the 60s for Georgia to have the best chance of winning, or maybe the best chance of winning comfortably. I once again go back to what I've always said. I like Georgia in the 30s. I like their opponents somewhere in the 20s, or maybe in the case of TCU, maybe it's somewhere in the teens. I don't think you want to give TCU a chance to find 21, 24 points, especially someone early, because all of a sudden then a team that scored against a lot of opponents might find their legs a little bit offensively. That the best overall indication of the impact the Georgia defense is making, in other words, might be just how many total points are scored in this game. I think for the most part, for the Georgia standpoint, there was way too much of it against Ohio State, and it created this sort of chaotic, wild affair that was difficult for anybody to win. But Georgia against the Horned Frogs, maybe they assert themselves a little bit more. Maybe it's one of those things where they're able to take the TCU offense, take its legs out from under it early, and then take the air out of the football and just kind of coast one of these, what do y'all call it, the murder ball type stuff, where you just finally march to a suffocating victory. I think after what we endured on Saturday, that might be a preferable conclusion to this one on Monday night. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Merriweather and Tharp, and we are go for two as we head towards Monday in Los Angeles, the national championship. And happy to have you with us as you are part of all of that with us. Whether you join us on video, we start live at 9:45 in the morning on DawgNation.com, the DawgNation app. We are 10 a.m. after that, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. We're on the radio at noon on App and Sports Radio 960 The Ref each and every day. Having a great time making the show possible for you. We're really looking forward to the Go for 2 and 22 conclusion here on Monday in Los Angeles. With that in mind, I'll give you one piece of housekeeping stuff. So this is a Thursday. We're going to record tomorrow's show this afternoon. I am flying during our normal broadcast window tomorrow, so we'll have to do things a little bit different to get ready for that. But to make it up to you, we're going to be live like a million times Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We're essentially going to treat these as more than just a regular day. We're going to treat these like we're going to try to give you action from Friday as the team gets there, throughout the day on Saturday, extra access here, some of the media day stuff like we have for the Peach Bowl. We'll have that again for L.A. We have a really fun thing, I think, in store on Sunday. Obviously, DawgNation Daily from L.A. on Monday. So we have so much to do to get you ready for all of this, and we'll kind of cover all of that with you throughout the weekend. But as a way of setting that up, I got to fly to L.A., which means I'm in the air during our normal broadcast window tomorrow. So just want to give you a quick heads up on that. Also, big thanks to our friends at Merriweather and Tharp for making this possible. Your source for Georgia divorce. You can find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com. And listen, I know Bob and Ashley Tharp. They've traveled around. They've seen these dogs so much. They're good friends of ours. Bob's the partner there at Merriweather and Tharp. Ashley's his wife. They got some great kids, and they love going to these Georgia games. And they're probably like so many of y'all are, just trying to figure out a way to get out to Los Angeles or do something like that. Well, listen, that's the kind of fun stuff they like to do. But during the week, when it's not a Georgia football game, Bob and his team over at Merriweather and Tharp, they're also working very hard for you in what might be a very challenging situation of your life. Because, listen, we believe that life kind of runs on parallel tracks. And on the one hand, you get the fun stuff of Georgia playing for a national championship. And yet at the same time, you may be dealing with something else in your life that's nowhere near as fun as all of that, right in the midst of this great era for Georgia football. You may be seeing a marriage that's coming to an end. And I'm not happy about that for you, and I know you're not happy about that for yourself. And if I could do something, and I truly mean this, if I could take that from you, I would. Absolutely. All of us would. We'd wave the magic wand. We'd make these things disappear. But unfortunately, reality sometimes just causes us to confront it. It requires us to deal with it. And if you are in a situation where your reality is, I am in a marriage that's not going to last, well, our friends at Merriweather and Tharp want to provide you counsel on that. And it starts with a free initial consultation. They'll walk you through all the proceedings. They'll talk about what divorce specifically, tangibly means for you and the unique set of circumstances that we all bring into a story like this. Merriweather and Tharp will talk about the law and how it can be leveraged for your benefit. And they'll tell you things that you didn't know. Every time I talk to Bob Tharp, who you just saw on the screen there a moment ago, every time I talk to him, he tells me stuff about this that I never would have considered if I'm not immersed in this topic each and every day. But they are at Merriweather and Tharp. So find them online, theatlantadivorceteam.com. That's theatlantadivorceteam.com. It's Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. All right, we're going to get Terence Edwards coming up in a moment. Terence will have a lot to say about what Georgia does against TCU. We will get that from him coming up then. Prior to that, though, let's go around the doghouse. And it's presented today by our friends at ServPro. And I want to kind of do this for a moment. So a minute ago, we played a little bit of audio from Greg McElroy on the notion of how do you stop Max Duggan and what does Georgia need to be aware of defensively. But in that same clip, McElroy also talked a little bit about, hey, maybe at this point in time, the TCU defense is actually a little bit better than you give them credit for, and be careful with that. And then he used the U word. And listen, this is the kind of thing that every Georgia fan wants to avoid in a huge way as you head towards Monday. The notion of an upset, the notion that TCU could shock the world. Well, if you listen to Greg McElroy, he at least offers this as a possibility. This is more from him on ESPN, talking about why that might be. Here is Greg McElroy.
I think TCU defensively, I know they gave up 1 million points, and I know that they got worn out as the game went along, but I think most people were pretty impressed, self included, with how they held up in the first 30 minutes of that ball game against a very physical Michigan football team. So I think TCU is actually a formidable opponent. Georgia's considerably better, but either way, if TCU plays their A game and Georgia repeats the performance that we saw tonight, TCU could definitely pull off one of the biggest upsets we've ever seen in college football.
So that's very interesting from McElroy saying, hey, if Georgia plays like it did against Ohio State and TCU plays at its best, we could be in line for an upset. I don't quite think I agree with that. I mean, listen, I'm all about talking about what Georgia didn't do against Ohio State, because I said before, it actually kind of makes me comfortable. I like it when people say bad things about Georgia in a weird way. It just makes me feel like that Georgia's in the right frame of mind for what it needs to be for a game. I sort of kind of like it when I feel like the public is buying high on Georgia's opponent. At least sometimes I kind of like that. But in this particular case, I think we're overstating what Georgia did against Ohio State from the negative standpoint. As I told you yesterday, I think the misnomer here is, and I'm not going to try to get on too much of a soapbox, I think the misnomer here is that if Georgia didn't have control of the game, then Ohio State must have. But I'm not actually quite so sure that was true. This is sort of the problem with a game that's played in the 40s. 42-41 sort of doesn't really feel like anybody's in control. It sort of feels like one of these wild bar fights where everybody's sort of flailing around and trying to do whatever they can do to make contact, and who knows how that's going to end. You get caught up in the wrong place, and all of a sudden it's a total mess. And to me, one of those 42-41 football games just sort of feels like that. Even 50-30 in the SEC championship sort of feels like that too. So I think that McElroy may be overstated. I mean, Georgia beat Ohio State, for goodness sakes. Ohio State was the preseason number 2 team. All of a sudden now Georgia has to apologize for beating the Buckeyes. And I'm not trying to beat up on McElroy. I think he's just trying to sell the game. I don't think he's trying to say anything bad about Georgia necessarily, but I do think we're exaggerating how poorly supposedly Georgia played against Ohio State. But nonetheless, McElroy's point is probably still well taken, which is if you allow TCU to think they can win, then they might. I mean, if you allow them to hang around, then they might. And while by, measured from a national championship game standpoint, a couple of touchdowns is a pretty big spread, y'all, there are 2 touchdown underdogs that went outright throughout, all the time in the regular season. I mean, this is not like some crazy occurrence in college football at large. It's a little bit of a unique point spread for a national championship, but it's not like this wild, outlandish spread compared, to a lot of games that typically, do take place. We see 2 touchdown favorites lose, with regularity. But the overall point, though, here is that Georgia does need to be at its best to prevent that from happening. And for what it's worth, just like we heard Javon Bullard earlier say, well, we're ready to be at our best. We didn't like the way we played against Ohio State. Stetson Bennett on the offensive side kind of said some of the same kind of stuff, too. This is Bennett on that topic once again from earlier this week.
Yeah, I think there were, stretches where we didn't play well, but then there are also stretches where we played really, really well. No matter, that all happened within the game, and so it's not like, we get less credit because it happened in a certain situation or what, but we just got to clean up those areas where we didn't play as clean for a little bit and not have to play basically perfect like we did in the fourth quarter.
Do you feel like you guys could play a lot better than you did on Saturday?
I think it's pretty apparent that we can. I mean, we opened up the second half with 2 3-and-outs. Now part of that is that Ohio State is an unbelievable team and they played really well. But yeah, I definitely feel like we can clean things up and play better than we did.
So a couple things from me here, and then we'll kind of move on and bring on Terence Edwards. I think one of the real dangers, if you're TCU and you look at Georgia, and this goes without saying, we all understand this, but when you really see this from the Fort Worth side of things for a moment, it's like the total array of playmakers just must be obscene to the eyes of a Horned Frog. And we said this yesterday. You want to talk about the talent advantage that Georgia has? The idea that Ladd McConkey's banged up, wasn't able to give you a full go, and so you turn to Arian Smith, and Arian Smith brought like world-class track speed on a home run touchdown that completely changed this game. Like if you're TCU, what do you do with that? Or this idea that there's a stable of running backs, and a guy like Kenny McIntosh at times in terms of the national conversation almost gets lost in the conversation. But if you add his rushing yards, receiving yards together, you're talking about a guy, I know Mike Griffith wrote a story about this, kind of about McIntosh this week, but if you add, the totality of the yardage for McIntosh together, you're talking about a guy that's 1,300 total yards, something along those lines in terms of his yards for scrimmage type stuff. He was the leading receiver for Georgia against Oregon. He's been a massive performer in the rushing game as well. Like if you're TCU, what do you do with that? It's the full array of offensive weapons that I think becomes really, really difficult to stop. But beyond that, though, if Bennett says, hey, we got to play better, what does better mean? I'm going to say the same thing about this kind of that I said about the defensive side here a moment ago, is that I think that Georgia has got to assert itself in such a way that makes the 4 quarters not matter. That there is just something about Georgia when it comes out really, really flexing, when it comes out really, really leaning on people, and we sort of see that quiet quit thing happen where the opponent's like, well, it ain't going to happen today. This team's providing more than we want. This team's got more than we can deal with. And so, therefore, we kind of turn the second half into a laugher with the way that Georgia plays in some of these kinds of situations. And I think that's kind of what this is supposed to be there as well. As I said before, I don't think you can have 62 total points here and feel like you're getting the kind of game that plays the most into Georgia's hands. And people who are smarter than me, and there's a long list of folks who are, like the one thing they're telling me right now is that means the 2 tight end stuff for Georgia is going to be really important. If Darnell Washington's healthy enough, then boom, that's probably all you need to worry about. But if Washington's not either healthy enough to play or healthy enough to be at his absolute best, then that does put a lot more on a guy like Oscar Delp. And we heard Javon Bullard say this week, I'm not going to play this audio for you, but we heard Bullard say this week that he felt fine about Delp being in there if Washington can't go. But one way, establishing that bigger line of scrimmage, the kind of wider line of scrimmage, and kind of challenging TCU. Do you really want to play a 3-3 stack when Georgia's got 7 guys in the line of scrimmage like this? Do you really feel like that's going to work for you? Kind of putting TCU's defense in conflict, not letting them do things they want to do. People who are smarter than me are telling me that whether Washington plays or not, that second tight end for Georgia, the ability to stay and have success in that 2 tight end set, is going to be really, really important here. So we've heard both guys, Bullard on the defensive side, Bennett on the offensive side of the ball. They both think that Georgia can play better. Well, guess what? If you can find a way to do it for just one more game, You are a national champion for the second straight year. Go for 2 in 22. It really is almost here. And that is Around the Doghouse. And it's presented today by our friends at ServPro. And listen, Georgia hopes to make a mess of TCU on Monday night in Los Angeles. But if you've got your own mess to deal with, and a lot of you do, let's just be honest here for a moment. What we had around Christmas was nasty, with pipes breaking all over the place and water. I mean, we had big storms this week, and listen, I hate that for the people who dealt with it. But once again, we saw flooded basements from that. We've seen flooded basements because of the water pipes bursting. We've had all this issue as of late. And if you've got your own cleanup situation like that around your house, our friends at ServPro are the names to know for all of that. And maybe it's something even worse for you. Maybe it's fire damage. Maybe you have a commercial building, a place that houses your business, which is obviously your livelihood. That's why you feed your family. Maybe you've had a big mess there because of a fire or something like that. Once again, our friends at ServPro are able to help you if you've got some sort of cleanup issue. Their restoration specialists want to put it all back together for you like it never even happened. That is what ServPro is famous for, and that is what they want to do for you there as well. And as I like to tell you, each and every ServPro franchise is also independently owned and operated. Let me tell you what that means. That means that the folks that run that particular ServPro franchise have just as much a stake in the outcome as you do. After all, when it comes to your home or your business being cleaned up after fire or water damage, something like that, you are obsessed with a positive outcome in that situation. The folks at ServPro are obsessed with that there as well, because that's how they continue to thrive as a business, by taking care of customers just like you. So find them online, servpro.com. That's SERV, servpro.com, for a lot more on that. Great to have them presenting Around the Doghouse to us here today. All right, before we're done, I thought Stetson Bennett also, as he frequently does, said something else pretty poignant this week. And I want to use that later on as a springboard to kind of explain to you how we're going to talk about this team and this game here for the rest of the week. Bennett's words, I think, well said on this. We'll get to that before we're done. There's also a bunch of weird stuff coming out of TCU and some weird stuff coming out of LA. I don't mind telling you, this is really pretty bizarre stuff. So we will get to that coming up here in just a little bit too. But for now, a great voice breaking it all down. TCU, formidable challenge. Georgia looking to bounce back in a weird way after beating Ohio State, I guess. We're going to call it a bounce back game coming up for Georgia. Either way, let's cover it all right now. It is Terence Edwards here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. Glad to have him and all of you on board with us here today.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
So I always love having Terence Edwards on the show. We had a great time on Saturday night enjoying that win for Georgia against Ohio State, and now looking ahead to what's going to happen against TCU on Monday. But Terence, let me kind of start right there for a moment. It seems kind of weird. You know, Georgia beat the preseason number 2 team in the country. You know, before the year began, literally seemingly, except for our show, everybody thought Ohio State was better than Georgia. And all of a sudden now Georgia's beaten Ohio State, and there's some folks out there that seem to think Georgia needs to apologize for the way in which they got it done. Like, what do you make of the notion that Georgia goes into a TCU game on Monday, a national championship, in the eyes of some with something to prove after the way they played? I use air quotes around something to prove after the way they played against Ohio State. In one respect, I sort of like the extra edge for Georgia. On the other side, though, it is a little bit of a weird narrative, just given the fact that Georgia's 14-0.
Right. I think, everyone thought that Ohio State was the best team at the beginning of the season, and rightfully so. They had the number one receiver coming back, which he didn't play this year. Now you have Marvin Harrison Jr. taking that mantle as the best receiver in the game. C.J. Smith is going to be one of the top quarterbacks taken in the draft. We coming back, and we lost 15 guys to the draft. Stetson Bennett is our quarterback. No way he could do what he did without the defense. So there's a lot of narratives around, this Georgia team that picked us not to be the best team, and they had every reason to do so. But man, just sitting back thinking about this season, BA, this morning, and what we're going to talk about today, man, this probably has been, one of the greatest seasons in college football, especially when you lose 15 guys into the draft, breaking in a lot of new players. The narrative around Stetson that he cannot lead this team, the defense led the team, he was just there for the ride. So this has been a memorable season that I'm going to remember for the rest of my life.
I totally agree with you, Terence. I think you're absolutely right about that. And when you look a little deeper at this Georgia defense for Monday, I mean, the one thing we would acknowledge is is that when Georgia has faced a lot of these really high-powered offenses like Ohio State was on Saturday, Ohio State found a way to get to 40. Alabama in last year's SEC championship game found a way to get to 40. LSU in the 2019 SEC championship game, they got to 37, but they clearly were getting, what they wanted kind of prior to that. You want to go all the way back to Oklahoma, maybe in the Rose Bowl of 2017. Once again, high-powered offense, scored plenty of points. I have said that I think the best version of Georgia on Monday includes a final score point total nowhere near the kind of 60-plus that the experts are sort of expecting here. TCU is averaging, more than 41 points per game this season. Do you think it's possible that Georgia can go against an offense like this that has scored points against virtually everybody? Do you think that Georgia can hold TCU to a low total, the kind of low 20s, high teens type performance that not only keeps the game well below the expected total, but also gives Georgia a chance to kind of coast in the second half the way we're used to seeing them do? They did do that to Tennessee earlier this year. They did that to Alabama in the national championship game a year ago. Can they do that again with TCU, though, on Monday?
That's what we all would like, but I just think going into this game is just too high profile. This game is a national championship game, and there's going to be a lot of peaks and valleys like the Ohio State game. Do I think it's going to be that of a nail-biter like that? I don't. But I do think this is going to be a very competitive football game, and I just warn the Georgia fan base to not really jump to conclusions about this TCU team. I don't think anyone thought that TCU deserved to be in the top 4. I did. I just don't think you can lose your conference game as an undefeated team and get knocked out when other teams didn't play. So I always thought that they should have been there. Me personally, I've said this on the air, I would like to face TCU in the first round and not Ohio State because I didn't see enough of TCU this year, and I can honestly say that. And I don't think a lot of people have either. But I was very impressed with what I saw from them the other night. They scored in multiple ways. They had a big-time running back in Miller who was a little dinged in the game, but he's a bowling ball at 220. They have a first-round NFL wide receiver at 6'4", being around 215 that we see that can run. So all hands is going to be full, and I just don't want everyone to expect that it's going to be a blowout. I expect a good game. I think we are the better team, and that would show later in the fourth. But I expect a good game, a hard-fought game, but I expect us to win, and not in a dramatic fashion like the past game, but win not going away, but just win this game handily in the fourth quarter.
Tell me about Quentin Johnston, the outstanding TCU wide receiver. Like, the one thing I noticed about him is obviously the size. Boy, that's a lot to deal with. But beyond that, I know you love studying these guys that do it at such a high level. What do you like about Johnston, and what, if you're a Georgia fan, ought to give you pause about what he might be able to do for these Horned Frogs?
Like I just said, I haven't watched. This is my first time really watching TCU play, and I was very impressed. So, but what I did see from them and just listening to the commentators that this whole year they are a vertical stretch team where they like to throw Johnson the ball down the field. And standing at 6'4", 215 pounds, one of the most impressive things when he caught the shallow cross against Michigan and went almost 75 yards just from a 3-yard throw, and he took it the distance. So he has the long speed to get downfield. He has the breakaway ability to be such a big receiver, and he's been touted to be one of the top receivers in the country. So I'm looking for this matchup against our secondary. So it's going to be another solid test for the secondary. And this could be Ringo's last game, and why not go against one of the top receivers in the draft to just get the narrative around you a way that I want this guy. I know Georgia defense does not travel, but every time you get an opportunity to go against this type, you got this guy. You got to be a little selfish and put some clean tape out there for the NFL scout. So it's a big test. Matt Duggan is a hard-nosed quarterback that will run the ball, and he's not going to slide. He's going to take on all tacklers, and in red zone they run him a lot. So it's going to be a game that we're going to have to stop. And everyone does not run the 3-3-5 defense. Yeah. What they do. We have had an opportunity to play a team that runs the 3-3-5, which Arkansas and Ole Miss runs the 3-3-5, so we do have some experience. but it's a hard defense for the offensive line. Everyone thinks because they only have 6 in the box that, we should be able to run against them. But go watch the Texas game when Bajan Robinson, who's probably the best back in college football, did not have a great day running the ball against this defense.
Yeah, along those lines, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but I think you do see the 3-3 stack a little bit more in high school. You're a high school coach. And you're obviously not going to give away your trade secrets here, but have you seen that? Has your brother seen a lot of that? He's obviously a great coach back there, your alma mater at Washington County. Like, from just a simple standpoint, what's the key to attacking that based on your own experience as a coach?
Yes, just for myself, I've been at Pace Academy for 6 years. Love it. Runs a version of the 3-3-5 stack, and going into a game plan, you always try to, numbers in the box, but it's really confusing for the offensive line. Who's the block? Zone, you would think zone blocking would be the thing to go to because you're not blocking the man, you're blocking the zone. So I think Coach Monken and crew will have a game plan ready because the last time we played against the 3-3-5, I think it was Arkansas, we put up a lot of points, and we didn't throw the ball very much. We was able to run the ball, and having Big O is going to be a big issue for him if he's playing or not, because he is that unsung hero in the run game that's able to block linemen, linebackers, or the secondary. Yeah. He has the ability to block on all 3 phases. So you're going to have to run the ball because you do have numbers, but the offensive line really has to be disciplined in who they're blocking and identifying the man that they're going to block in the run scheme.
Yeah, Mississippi State kind of runs a version of that too, although Kirby Smart had said this week it is a good bit different. A couple other things here really quick. You mentioned Keely Ringo a moment ago, and obviously I know that Ringo's kind of been in the spotlight with some Georgia fans and maybe for the wrong reasons and maybe at times unfairly criticized, but one way or another, I got a little bit of a hunch here, Terence, that Georgia may be really glad it's got a big cornerback like Ringo. When you think about Johnston being, 6'4", about 215 pounds, it's a big wide receiver. Georgia's recruiting profile for defensive backs, when they're recruiting kind of the two-way athlete now, if that's a small guy, you can pretty well be assumed they're going to try him as a slot receiver. And, there's just sort of a kind of a height size requirement they seem to be pursuing for defensive backs right now. The bigger corner like Ringo, on Monday, we may be really glad that Georgia's got a guy that size if he's doing battle with a guy like Johnston, because pretty clearly Johnston wants to use his size here.
Oh, most definitely. My first time seeing Keely was his freshman year, and the first thing that stands out is how big and how tall he is. So this is going to be a really good matchup for him. I think it may be a little bit more easier matchup because Johnson is so big. He's different as a receiver than some of these smaller receivers because he takes him a lot longer to get in out of his breaks because his hips, and he's so tall. He's not as quick, but he's straight line fast. So it's going to be a good test for both of these guys. Both of these guys have been mock draft to be first-round picks, so it's going to be a good matchup for these two.
If you want to give a little bit more context here, ESPN's got him mock draft, like number 12 overall. In the first round of the upcoming NFL draft, to give you an idea of the kind of talent he brings to the table. Terence, one of our listeners or viewers the other day put this in the chat, and I thought this was a great point. I wish I could give credit to who it was. Do you think there's ever been a scout team quarterback more built and sort of made to be the guy that he's pretending to be when it comes to Gunnar Stockton in this particular case, trying to be like Max Duggan? A guy that, listen, one day Gunnar Stockton may be just as good a player as Duggan's proven to be this year, but in terms of giving you a Duggan-like look, doesn't it seem like Gunnar Stockton in a lot of ways just sort of made to do that?
Right, he does, and that's who I compare him to. After watching Max Duggan the other day, I think Gunnar is very similar in skill set. Gunnar is he's 6'1", but he's thick in his lower body. He's a tough-nosed runner. He has a cannon of an arm. So if you had to have a quarterback to mimic TCU's quarterback, we have the perfect guy already there, a la Stetson Bennett doing with Baker Mayfield. So, if history repeats itself and Gunnar could be just as good as Matt Duggan, as Stetson has been just as good as Baker Mayfield, even though he didn't win the Heisman. He's doing something team-wise, having an opportunity to win back-to-back championships. There's not a lot of quarterbacks in college football that lay claim to that. And You know me, I've been the president of Stetson Bennett fan club for 2 years.
Yeah.
And he's going to be able to do something that a lot of other quarterbacks have not been able to do, and we won't be able to take that away from him.
Terence, great stuff. Thank you for being here today. We'll look forward to having you as part of our Dog Nation post-game show coming up on Monday night there as well. Your insight always so valuable as Georgia tries to go for 2-22 and win another national championship. So we appreciate that. Enjoy these last couple of days here and try to pass this time before the big game takes place. And we will look forward to talking to you again very soon.
So before I go, B.A., when is John Stinchcomb coming on the show?
Hey, he was on Monday, and I guess he'll be on again on Monday as well, yes.
So I have to call him. What is his time slot?
He's normally the same time you are, right around 10:20, or maybe 10:30 because I'm usually running late.
John just called me right before the show, and I told him that I was about to go on. He would not allow me to get off the phone. I did not answer the phone. I almost missed my call. So I have to get him back. I'm throwing him up on the bus, and I told him that I was about to go on, and he would not let me off the phone.
I like it, Terrence.
I have to get him back and hold him on the phone when it's his time slot for DawgNation.
I like that, Terrence. You get him back. Monday will be your time to do that.
Thanks, B.A. Look forward to you next week, and hopefully it will be in conversation of back-to-back.
Boy, I love it, Terrence. That's great stuff. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
It is fun to think about. I mean, it's the kind of thing that is just really sort of unimaginable stuff. And, you don't want to – it's almost like you don't want to contemplate it too much. I mean, I'll tell you a quick story. Then we got a thousand things we got to do. And I think I told this story on the air. So last year when Georgia had its home finale against whoever that would have been, I forget who it would have been now, probably like Charleston Southern or something like that. It was kind of a weird team, I think, to play your last home game against, but I believe it was against Charleston Southern. One of my colleagues in the press box sort of said to me in passing of, hey, I'll see you, later, maybe even back here in January. And that was the first time I'd considered the idea, well, gosh, if Georgia wins the national championship, I guess there will be a parade, and I guess there will be some sort of celebration. I guess there will be some sort of, that's just what you do when you win a championship. It seems so foreign to us because, as the rival fans had told us, we had not done that in such a long time. But that's what you do when you win a national championship. And it became this realization of, oh, my gosh, something very, very big might soon happen. And it seemed really scary to even speak that out loud because it almost seemed like you were, just kind of celebrating something until it hadn't happened yet. But I remember how sizable of an idea that first seemed to me. Well, here we are now, a year later, and all of a sudden, it doesn't quite seem so, taboo to mention, hey, there may be another parade. There may be another celebration there. That all may go down because we just all experienced so much of that a year ago. It could happen. It very well might happen. Again, it doesn't seem quite so taboo to talk about it. But in one respect, there's also an additional level of significance around this because all of a sudden now you're not talking about just a national championship. You're talking about the heavyweight of a back-to-back national championship. And Connor Riley, I know our colleague at DawgNation, has got a really good story coming up later on today at DawgNation.com that at least has to be considered. That while we have seen back-to-back national champions before, we haven't seen one in the playoff era, but we've seen one within the last decade or so. Bama won in 2011, 2012. It is also fair to point out that we have seen instances for teams that after they won the national championship, coming back with a chance to do it again, and for whatever reason, it just didn't quite work out. And some of that was in the postseason, or some of that was a late loss in the regular season that prevented it from happening, because in almost every situation, and you can go back and test this yourself, a lot of you keep these old preseason magazines, things like that. In almost every situation in which a team has won the national championship, that team has been highly rated to begin the following year. In almost every situation, that's been the case. So in almost every sense, a national champion began the next year, took with it into the year some sort of aspiration of winning the national championship. Once again, that's just kind of the way that it works out. How commonly do you see in sports the team that was won it a year ago somehow picked to do it again the next year? We didn't see that with Georgia this year, but they were preseason number 3, and that's, you just sort of see a little bit of a high ranking for the teams that have won national championships. So somehow, some way, what had a chance to be, for whatever reason, just didn't quite materialize. And so Georgia has avoided this now for 14 games. Can they avoid it for just one more game? Can they find something within themselves for just one more game? We're going to talk more about this in a moment, but when you really, as Terence kind of pointed out, when you really think about the weight, the consequence of the next football game we're going to watch Georgia play, man, it is a lot to wrap your mind around. It really, really is. So we'll get back to that in a moment. For now, though, let me tell you, we're cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, and boy, what a fun time it's going to be for us. My wife and kids were talking to me last night because once we get back, or I get back from L.A., once we're on the other side of that, well, all of a sudden my family getting very, very close to a family vacation cruise. And there's just something sort of about that. Listen, don't get me wrong. I love being with all of you on the DawgNation cruise, and I had a great time with some of my colleagues a few days ago, and we took a little short getaway on Wonder of the Seas for kind of a special promotional type thing. I was so grateful that Royal Caribbean invited me to be a part of that. But there is something about that family cruise where after a long time of, we're like, our family's like everybody else. We've had so much going on. We've had so many, things happening in life, some of it good, some of it not quite so good, all of it making us very busy, and we're not different from you. You feel the exact same way. That opportunity to kind of unplug and get away and say, hey, we got the greatest life in the world, but for this particular week, we want to kind of put that life beside us and just sort of enjoy just the fun, the entertainment, the food, the everything else that kind of comes along with a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. Boy, I can't wait to do all of that. And I would invite you to do the same thing here in 2023 there as well. And I would invite you to be a part of that with us on our DawgNation cruise too. So whether it's the DawgNation cruise, the second ever cruise with DawgNation coming up this April, or your own Royal Caribbean cruise vacation with you and your family or friends, whatever else, Jessica Slater, a great travel agent, can help you out there. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also visit the website she's put together, royaldogs.com. Terrific website, royaldogs.com, that gives you all the details about our second ever cruise with DawgNation. Onboard Independence of the Seas, leaving out of Port Canaveral, going to Perfect Day, Coco Cay, going to Nassau in the Bahamas, and having a great time with all that. Boy, I can't wait to see so many of you on board with us. Last year, turned into a national championship celebration. This year might turn into kind of the same thing. We watched the NFL draft live, the first round, the final night, big draft party. We may do all of that all over again. That is going to be a great time. All right, so I call this cruise around the SEC. This is really all just sort of national championship related, but this is just sort of the only place we could slide it into the show. So there are a couple of weird things going on here just for a moment. Let me start with the tailgating thing. A lot of you have been kind of following this. So the official report here is, and you can read more about this at AJC.com, a lot of different places kind of covered this. The official report here is that tailgating is banned from SoFi Stadium. What does that mean exactly? I still am not completely sure, to be honest, because I've had a lot of people sharing me all kinds of conflicting information on this. In fact, let me show you one photo that a dog fan sent to me that maybe calls some of this into dispute. Do we have this? Can we show this here for a second? So John Tisdale shared this with me. He says, for those concerned about no tailgating, this is from the Charger game at SoFi a few weeks back. He says, I think we'll be just fine. So listen, and if you're not watching the show, if you're listening to radio podcast, you see some tents, you see some flags, you see some folks walking around. It does look like a tailgate. I don't know if John was there for that, if he's reporting this back from the live occurrence. Here's all I can tell you, is it sounds like to me you're not going to roll up to the parking lot and throw up the tent and throw up the grill and just get right to doing it the same way you would, certainly when the game was Atlanta this past weekend. Somehow, some way, it seems different than that. I think a lot of this is kind of pushing you towards those ticketed tailgates, which I don't have a problem with. And frankly, to be honest with you, given the fact that, who's flying with their tailgate supplies anyway? Unless you're, close enough to drive, most people are kind of flying out there anyway. So if you have a little bit more of the ticketed style tailgates where it's kind of the, sort of antiseptic atmosphere, but at the same time, they got a sort of one-stop shop, everything taken care of, then maybe that's what you need in a situation like this. I honestly don't know, but I will tell you this. You need to do some research on this because I've heard 1,000 different things. One way or another, it seems it is true that you're not just going to kind of plant your flag right there in the parking lot and get after it the same way you would do it, over on North Campus or something like that in Athens or, wherever it is that you're kind of, doing that around the UGA campus. It seems like it's not going to quite be that, but there are, I guess, opportunities here. It's one of those things you just need to kind of learn about. This is definitely going to be weird. It is a huge culture shock when a city like L.A. is hosting a game like this. And unlike the Rose Bowl, because my understanding is, having been in Pasadena and walking around before the game, Pasadena is a little bit not like California, at least the best that I can tell. Pasadena is just kind of a nice, sort of, I don't know. To me, Pasadena was kind of far removed from the LA proper that we sort of think of when we think of Los Angeles. And I think most of the people outside the Rose Bowl were having normal, regular tailgates. I remember that day I parked in kind of a grass lot outside the stadium, and most people were doing just sort of regular tailgate stuff. So this is a good bit different, I would say, than what happened when Georgia was out there for the Rose Bowl. It might have been a little bit more similar to last year in Indianapolis, but the truth is, to use bad grammar intentionally, ain't nobody tailgating when it's 1 degree anyway. So I don't really know what people did prior to the game against the Alabama Crimson Tide in Indianapolis last year, but it sure as shooting wasn't tailgate because it was freezing cold. I mean, like painfully cold outside prior to the game. So I think a lot of folks were indoors for that anyway. My understanding is there is not a lot of bar, restaurant, establishment type stuff out there around SoFi Stadium. Once again, I can't confirm that to be true because I've not been to this particular venue. This will be my first time going there. But have a good plan. Have a good plan, because the cool thing about Indianapolis was everybody was just sort of walking around. I think once we got to Indianapolis, I don't think anybody drove the rest of the weekend. That's not the way that LA is going to be. It's going to be a bunch of Uber stuff, or if you've got a rental car, you're going to be doing that. I know we're staying over near the airport. Obviously, getting to SoFi Stadium for there. The stuff downtown going to take a little bit more time to get to. If you're going to Hollywood or something like that, that's going to take a little bit of time there as well. So have a good plan. It's just going to be a little bit different type setup than the Rose Bowl was, certainly Indianapolis was last year. So make sure you have a good plan for all of that, whether it be on game day or the weekend getting together. But my guess is everywhere you turn, you're going to see UGA fans. So it may all turn into a giant tailgate party before it's all said and done. Also, there's this. Are you familiar with a guy named Mattress Mac? I guess Mac became famous a few years ago because he'd done one of those sort of like mattress type deals where, hey, if you Astros win the World Series, you get a free mattress or something along those lines. And as a way of offsetting his investment in that promotion, he started making some very big bets. And so since then, Mattress Mac has kind of become a very famous sports bettor because he's throwing down huge dollars on a lot of sporting events. And so our friends at the Action Network have reported, and I'll show this to you there as well, Mattress Mac, who's a Texan who lives, I think, in Houston, has put a big $1.5 million bet on TCU to beat Georgia. Now, let me tell you something a lot of you already know. That just because you place a big bet does not make you a sharp bettor. In fact, if Mattress Mac was a sharp bettor, they wouldn't take $1.5 million from him on anything, because there are a lot of people who are thought to be edge players who make much smaller bets than that, who can't get their bets down from time to time because the casinos oftentimes don't accept wagers they think they might lose. So Mattress Mac throws down $1.5 million on TCU here in this spot. I don't think that does anything to the point spread or does anything to your evaluation of how, Georgia may win or lose this game. There are some very sportsbook-friendly media outlets that will report on this kind of stuff because it just sort of creates a lot of buzz and attention for them. But ultimately, this isn't worth anything in terms of who's actually going to win this game. But you know what? I hate to be spiteful like this, but the idea that somebody who believes in the Horned Frogs this much being $1.5 million slider on Monday at least kind of makes me want to chuckle here a little bit. Now, I guess Mac must be a very rich guy that he feels like he can do all this, and he has won some of his bets, I guess. He wouldn't keep doing it if he wasn't. So maybe that'll give you one more thing to laugh at once Georgia wins, Mattress Mac being a 7-figure sum of money less rich when this is all said and done. And then one more thing here, and once again, speaking of our friends at the Action Network, Darren Rovell had this. And as I said before, this is another one of these sort of weird things that's sort of hard to figure out. So, as you know, at a place like Georgia, when there's a big game like this, the demand for tickets within the allotment given to the school is so high. I want to say the cutoff for the Peach Bowl, for instance, was somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 points. That's an astronomical figure. You're talking about Mattress Mac type people at Georgia who've contributed enough to kind of create that kind of point total and that kind of sort of relationship with the athletic association that they're getting those kind of tickets. And obviously the national championship cut off really high and something like that too. So what Darren Rovell had reported is that TCU had not sold its full allotment of tickets. And they were only given, I think, 5,000, which is another thing that kind of frustrates some Georgia fans too, is how few official tickets were given to the Athletic Association by Peach Bowl or now CFP National Championship game. So of the original allotment of 5,000, Darren Rovell had reported a couple of days ago that TCU didn't sell out its allotment. Well, TCU has come back and said now, oh, yes, we did. We sold all of our tickets. And so I guess what the dispute here is, if you look at the Twitter replies, which is always kind of a risky proposition, but if you look at the Twitter replies, I guess what the dispute here is that Rovell had reported this prior to the college football playoff when, I mean, let's face it, Georgia's allotment for whatever game would have, been scarfed up 6 years ago. So, I guess prior to the Fiesta Bowl, TCU had not sold its allotment of tickets. Maybe they were thinking they weren't going to win the game, but it's also the issue I think we're kind of getting to here. This is just a much smaller fan base, that you didn't have the built-in demand prior to TCU winning the Fiesta Bowl of them selling all 5,000 of their tickets. And what some folks are saying now is that eventually TCU was just sort of selling these to anybody. It wasn't the well-established donors. It wasn't the people who had accrued extra value because of what they'd given the Athletic Association. They were just blasting out emails, basically just sort of selling them to anybody. And that's probably one of the reasons why the get-in price for this game has actually gone dramatically down. Now, the airfare to get to Los Angeles is astronomical, and that's a prohibitive cost for many, many people. But if you could find a way to get to Los Angeles, the price to get in the stadium is actually going down. We predicted it would because, listen, TCU is a good team, but it's just not a very big fan base. It does not have nearly the following that a Michigan would have in this spot or an Ohio State would have if they were the opponent for Georgia in the national championship. You just don't have nearly the same level of following. So the point here is you've had TCU fans kind of going back and forth with Rovell about how many of the tickets they actually sold, but one way or another, I think you have an indication that you may not see tons of TCU fans in Los Angeles, that the opportunity maybe exists for this Go for 2 in 22 day for Georgia to maybe take over the stadium. If fans from Georgia can find a way to get there, they may have a chance to take over that stadium. We'll make this cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. All right, I want to get back to the Georgia Bulldogs here for a moment. And it's DawgNation Daily presented by Merriweather and Tharp. I told you earlier that Stetson Bennett had some really interesting things to say the other day when he met with the media. And one of the questions our buddy Chip Towers kind of asked him was, hey, do you realize where you're kind of getting to in terms of the historical category here, Georgia, both from a numeric standpoint and also just sort of a perception standpoint? Do you sort of realize where you're getting on that? How much of that are you aware of? Chip kind of asked Stetson. I thought that Stetson gave a pretty thoughtful answer. Let me let you hear Stetson on this, and I got a couple thoughts on that. Take a listen to Stetson earlier this week.
I'd say I'm as updated as I want to be. No, not yet, Chip. We still got a season, and we still got one more game left, and all that stuff will still be there after that. If I do want to look at it eventually, but now's not the time.
I think that Stetson Bennett's words are very wise, and not just for him, but for all of us. And I've said this week that after what happened in the Peach Bowl, it is now completely undisputed that Bennett is a historic figure in the Georgia program, and you can determine for yourself what that historic definition is. Is he the greatest quarterback of all time? Is he the second best player of all time because of the importance of the quarterback position? For me, I'm going to tell you that Herschel Walker is forever unquestioned the best player in program history. I don't think anything that's happening right now nudges Walker off his perch as best player in program history. But one way or another, maybe Bennett belongs on kind of like sort of the Mount Rushmore idea of what goes next to him there on that. Whatever the historic definition is, it's a conversation we do need to have, and I think eventually we will. But I believe that Bennett is right when he says, no need to have that right now, and maybe I won't even participate that. Bennett himself saying, hey, that may be something for other people to have about me. I may not need to participate in that. But what makes the question interesting for Bennett is he's clearly a student of UGA history. He knows the history of this program pretty well because he grew up rooting for the team. So his insight into his own place in Georgia history probably is a little more poignant than what maybe someone else might be because he's actually followed the history of this program for such a long time. But beyond that, I think what Bennett says there is also really important for all of us from the standpoint of, hey, there is a lot being said right now that can probably just sort of wait, right? I mean, I hear a lot of Georgia fans say, because we do Go for 2 in 22, I hear a lot of Georgia fans say, what about Go for 3 in 23 or Go for 4 in 24? What about the idea that Georgia may even be better next year than they are this year? Or what about the idea that, Georgia may just blast TCU, win the game by 100 points or whatever it is that kind of comes up? Listen, All of that might end up being true, right? Georgia really might be. I mean, obviously, I've kind of done some of the math on this. I see what Georgia has the potential to have next season. They're not without questions, but boy, they could be really good. All of that is potentially true. But as Bennett says, can we just wait for a minute? Can we just play one more game and then figure out, what the place of this team in history is? Can we actually put the punctuation on the sentence before we get to anything like that? Can we actually get to that point before we worry about that? I think that Bennett's right. Listen, this is a game on Monday night in which Georgia's favored. I mean, I do feel like the Georgia sets up pretty well for the game against TCU. I don't just like the talent edge for Georgia. I kind of like the matchup as well. I think it sets up really well for Georgia. But at the same time, I also just want to see it play out. I want to have the satisfaction of seeing Georgia finish all of this off. And then after that, we can talk about the history. We can talk about the what comes next. We can talk about the potential building of a dynasty or an empire, whatever we want to say around all of that. We can do all of that then. But as Stetson Bennett says, can we focus on just one more game before we get there? I think that Bennett's words are probably pretty wise. Also, quick shout out before we say goodbye to you here today. Obviously, we're looking forward to watching the home team way far away from home coming up on Monday. We have a really good time with all of that. And by the way, speaking of the home team, that's what our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau are there as well. They're always the home team. What that means is they've got agents and claims adjusters, friendly folks right here in our state, communities just like yours, all across the state of Georgia, taking care of you when it comes to your insurance needs. They understand, hey, that auto insurance you have, that's the thing that protects your vehicle that gets you to work each and every day. That home insurance you have, that's the thing that keeps a roof over your head and the place where you create your great memories with your family, but also maybe your most important investment there as well. Our folks at Georgia Farm Bureau, Georgians just like you, they understand all of that, and that's why they want to step up and provide you more than just an insurance experience. So you can find them online at gfbinsurance.com. That website, once again, gfbinsurance.com. I can tell you this, they are very, very excited about Monday. They've been with us the entire ride here on Go for 2 and 22. I think they also think that Georgia finishes it off on Monday there as well. So big shout out to them, our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. Find them online, gfbinsurance.com. All right, so tomorrow we will do a big Friday shoes dump to get you ready for the game on Monday. Kind of that good vibes thing we like to create around here. We'll do that from a pre-recorded fashion because I'm going to be in the air during our normal broadcast window. But for now, one good, fun golden shoe to give to you here before we wrap up today's show. Our buddy James Lawson, who's gotten golden shoes before, I think this is really funny. He puts on Twitter, if you see this, it's too late. And what it is, it's starting with Baker Mayfield in 2017, hands on the knees, head bowed in disappointment. You got Brian Kelly there, and then you got Ryan Day doing the same thing. On Saturday night, you could have put Bryce Young in that category too after he threw the interception to Keely Ringo last year. That's good stuff from James Lawson. That is a golden shoe there as well. All right, y'all, we're getting close. Los Angeles going to be here before you know it. Getting ready for it. Can't wait. By the way, also Gator Hater Countdown. Lousy, stinking Gators don't know anything about that. 296 days from now, Georgia will beat them. But there is business to be taken care of prior to that. We will see you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. Go for 2 and 22, everybody. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that. All right, quick, kind of, I guess, beg your pardon here. We are not going to go crazy long on comments today because our studio is actually being used for something else here later on today. And then, obviously, I can't do comments with you tomorrow because I'm going to be on the air. But here's what I'm going to tell you. We're going to do 8 million shows from Los Angeles, literally Friday night, several times on Saturday, couple times on Sunday, even a really special thing, maybe two, which I'll tell you about hopefully tomorrow. We're going to have a lot of time for comments between now and the time that Georgia gets on that plane and comes back with the national championship trophy in hand. So we'll do a few today and then do a lot more from L.A. coming up later on this week. So with that in mind, let me pop over. I'm going to go YouTube first and kind of roll through all of these and just get ready for a great, great next couple of days. So on YouTube here for a moment. Tyson Keever says, my ears perked up when Terence Edwards mentioned that TCU was a lot like Arkansas. Didn't a certain UGA quarterback save the game that day? It's a really good point. And it's one of those moments for Bennett because so much has happened since then. That game sort of gets forgotten. Some people will be like, well, can Stetson Bennett bring Georgia back if they're trailing? what did he do in the first game he ever played in against Arkansas? Georgia was about to lose that day as about a 30-point favorite, and Bennett came marching them back. And so, yeah, he carved up that Barry Odom defense pretty well there that day. Is TCU better defensively than Arkansas is? I grew really, and some of y'all know this, I grew to very much not like Barry Odom as Arkansas's defensive coordinator, as somebody who openly roots for Sam Pittman. I grew to very much not like Odom in that spot. So, I wonder how accurate the comparison is. Kirby did say earlier this week that for a number of reasons, he wouldn't really reveal what those reasons were, but for a number of reasons, the Mississippi State defense and the TCU defense, even though they're both kind of the 3-3 stack look, they're not really all that comparable. So I wonder what the Arkansas thing would be there as well. Like the other thing that let me just say that. Something else about TCU. I'm just going to say that for now. Walker Dog says, is Eric Ainge just jealous? He totally is. And, frankly, I think it's even a disservice to Stetson Bennett to say that Eric Ainge is even worthy of being jealous of Stetson Bennett. I mean, Eric Ainge would be jealous of a lot of quarterbacks far down the trough from where Stetson Bennett is. And, frankly, we mentioned the Ainge thing yesterday because fans seem to be having fun with it. But it's just not, to me, worth amplifying all that much because Ainge did this before the Tennessee game, and he got completely humiliated. And we think that, track record ought to matter here. If you make a big statement, you get totally trampled on. I don't think you have the same platform to come right back out and say the same crazy thing again. The only reason we mentioned the Ainge stuff yesterday at all is because, as I said, to me, it kind of crystallizes the Stetson Bennett hater now, is they can't evaluate him on the basis of anything negatively, so they just have to admit, I'm just rooting against him, which is kind of probably what the case has been all the time anyway. So that's really the only reason we even mentioned the Ainge thing here yesterday, was just from the standpoint that literally the only thing he had left to be is a hater. Jonathan Aaron says, can you see Ric Flair in purple saying, go Horned Frogs, Hypno-Toad, woo, Max Duggan's going to be styling and profiling. Yeah, unfortunately, I can't see that. And I told y'all yesterday, Ric Flair would have to say something bad about my family for me to ever disavow Ric Flair. But his behavior as a sports fan, I find to be reprehensible. And I love Ric Flair. But his sports fan behavior is reprehensible. And last year before the Orange Bowl, he completely humiliated himself. And Flair's had a couple of those moments here. But you'll never hear me say a bad word about Rick. But, yeah, that's unfortunately the case. Jay Shipe says, I won't read his comment because it doesn't fit the narrative of putting Stetson on a pedestal. I mean, Jay, I'll read anything, I guess. No, not anything. Listen, Jay's had some comments before that I wouldn't read, but I don't know that I wouldn't read this one. Scott Harris, I did see this. I guess there was a report that Big O was seen at the basketball game last night without the boot. So I did see that. I don't know what that means. And, I mean, look, my brain right now is kind of in such a weird place. When I heard that online, there was a part of me that wondered, well, is this just a game on the part of Kirby? Because you obviously can't miss Darnell Washington. If he's walking around Stegman Coliseum, you obviously can't miss him. By the way, how about the basketball team? If we had more time, we would give them a huge shout-out for what they did against Auburn. Trust me, I am thrilled about that. If it wasn't a national championship week, I'm sure we would be mentioning more about that. A great win last night at Stegman Coliseum against Auburn. But, so the report was Darnell was there and seen without a walking boot. I guess I take that as good news. I really do. I think that Darnell Washington would be really important for Georgia in this game. I'm talking about the kind of thing that might – I don't want to overstate it, but I think that TCU would have a very difficult time with Darnell Washington. I really, really do. I don't want to overstate it, as I said before. I just want Georgia to win the game, and then after that we'll talk about all the other stuff. I think the presence of Darnell Washington would be a real problem for TCU. So I saw the report. I don't even mind saying who. It was our buddy Jordan Hill from 24/7. He's the one that had it. At least he's the one that I saw it from. So he said it. I obviously would believe what he said. What does it mean? I don't know. But if that's good news for Georgia, ooh boy, it is tough for the folks from Fort Worth if that's the case. Brian McPhail says, with Washington Bowers in the field, how will they cover? Yeah, I think the TCU has a lot of that kind of stuff where you're just sort of faced to figure out who you cover. But it's also, I mean, just think about the numbers here. You know, TCU wants to play that three-man front defensively. Now, they want to move guys around, things like that. But ultimately, it's that three-man, kind of down lineman thing in the front. Well, if Georgia's got 7 guys across the line of scrimmage, and one of those is Darnell Washington, who's basically 2 guys, like, what do you do with that? I mean, so a long time ago, I went to this coaching clinic thing because at one point in time I thought maybe I might be a coach. This is more like basketball, but I'll go to this coaching clinic thing. And this one coach who's semi-famous, but he said something that I thought was really, really interesting. And this is the inverse of what I'm talking about now, but I'm going to say it anyway. He said that as a coach on defense, I'm not trying to stop you. I'm trying to get you to do something you don't want to do, which I thought was a really interesting way of looking at this. He says, listen, I'm not even trying to stop you. I just want to make you do something in which you don't want, something you're uncomfortable with, and you may just stop yourself. And I thought that was really interesting. And to me, it's the same thing here as well. We talked about the Gillespie guy, the TCU defensive coordinator. He's a pretty sharp guy. But if Georgia shows the big front and, frankly, has more success with that big front offensively than what TCU had, well, all of a sudden TCU now has to try to play defense just a different kind of way. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But to me, this is the genesis of every good coaching chess match, the game within the game. The genesis of all that is, hey, who can do something to make the other side not get to do what they plan to do? Who can force that first alteration? Because we always talk about, hey, in-game adjustments. But the truth is like when you adjust to something in-game, you are adjusting away from what your best plan was because obviously you would go into a game with your best plan. So who can get the other side to kind of toss its best game plan first? Well, all of a sudden that goes a long way, I believe, towards determining how these games play out. So if Georgia creates the extra success with the second tight end, if that is Darnell Washington, kind of creating more run lanes, right? It's more stuff to kind of run through. All of a sudden you're just you're spreading that TCU defense out and you're making them be something they don't want to be. Let's go. Brandon says, and this is an interesting question. He says, even if Big O isn't fully healthy, do you think that Kirby would play him, being that it's the last game of the year? Yeah, I think that one way or another we'll see Washington in uniform and we may see him go out there. But here's Lesko, something I really believe, is that I don't think we have a proper appreciation sometimes for the third category. We think about guys healthy and playing. We think about a guy being hurt and out. I don't think we have an appreciation for the category of the guy is out there, but he's pretty clearly not himself. I think that probably happens in football far more often than we realize. And in terms of actually determining the outcome of games, a number of players kind of in that status, I think changes the way in which a team plays more so than just star player not playing. I really do believe, because a lot of this we're not really aware of, is that some teams are trying to conceal injury status, and sometimes they may actually be successful in that we don't know that so-and-so is banged up, but the team itself does. And if you really watch the film, you'd see a guy being ineffective. On any given snap in a football game, there's just so much going on that you can't properly – and some of y'all know more about X's and O's than I do, but even those of you who know more about it than I do, when you're watching a game in real time, you can't process it all. You just can't see it all in real time. But if you did have the ability to kind of be omniscient, if you had that sort of omniscient ability to see everything that was happening, I think oftentimes you would see one of the real determining factors in games sometimes being a player who's out there, but he's not really out there, if you get the drift on that. Let's see. Michael, can we go to 11:30? Do we have time to do that? Is 11:30 okay? Okay, are you sure? Yeah, that's fine. All right, so I told you, let's do this. We have somebody else coming in the studio. Let's do about 5 more minutes. We'll get off in about 5 minutes. About 5 more minutes and we'll get off. Let's go to Facebook here for a moment. We haven't been there yet. About 5 more minutes. And then as I said before, we won't have comments tomorrow, but we will have a really big number of those coming up throughout the weekend. We're going to do so many shows, y'all. You think we're going to go to L.A. and not do a million shows? Of course we are. Randy Hall says, kudos to the basketball team beating the barn. I got to tell you, I like Mike White a lot. And when White, before he came to Florida, I liked him a lot too. He was the Creighton coach, is that right? I think before there. And so he was a guy, I think it was Creighton. He was a guy that I was a little bit aware of and had a really good reputation as a coach. I think that reputation kind of got harmed at Florida a bit. But as, what's his name? The analyst Rothstein said, even with, kind of Florida fans sort of souring on him, he was still winning games at the NCAA tournament level at a clip that most SEC teams kind of weren't. I was not all that excited about White when they first hired him, but as we said on the show, at least the brief times we've talked about this, he does start to grow on you a little bit when you realize, and I hate to be this way, but the Georgia track record for previous success is just so low that does Mike White exceed that in his coaching career? Of course he does. And last night was fun. I watched that game on television. Those of you who were at Stegman Coliseum, you had a blast with that. I'm telling you, I've got room for college basketball in my life. I'd love nothing more. Now, on this show, we'll still obviously talk football because that's what our audience wants. But in terms of my own personal, preferences, I'd love nothing more than to come back from Los Angeles, celebrate a national championship, and settle in for a really fun run for Georgia through the men's basketball slate in the SEC. I'd love nothing more than to do all that. Philip Jordan Wells, always very funny. Always very funny. Let's see what else. Matthew Deal says, do you think we'll see our defensive line shift like they have early in the season to cause disruptions and false starts? I hope so, because I love it when they do that. And it is very, very tough to deal with. Very tough to deal with. Eric DeVorncy says, the state of Georgia's got some great basketball talent. You got to win and keep those guys at home, and maybe that's what Mike White's going to have a chance to do. Greg Childer says, Stegman Coliseum is going to be rocking soon if they keep on. Yeah, I was going to those games mid to late 90s when Tubby Smith was there, transitioning to the Jim Herrick era. I got to tell you, it's really fun. A lot of you think, or some of you may think incorrectly, that Georgia's never had any basketball passion whatsoever. In comparison to, like, say, Duke, maybe not. But when Georgia was winning games and making regular appearances in the NCAA tournament, Stegman Coliseum was a great place to be, and I believe it can be a great place again. I think it was a pretty great place to be last night. Jay Harwell says, bring us back a win from Cali. Jay, that's what I'm hoping to do. That's what I'm hoping to do. Steve Schiavini says he was at Louisiana Tech prior to that. Excuse me. I guess Dana Altman would have been the Creighton coach. Pardon me on that. Thank you very much. Let's see what else. Matt Rugavina says Mattress Mac is definitely a hero in the Houston area. He sheltered homeless people during Harvey. That said he put money on. See, don't tell me that, man. I don't want to know that he's a good guy like helping homeless people. I want to laugh at him when he loses $1.5 million. So don't tell me that he's taking care of the homeless and things like that, because that only makes it harder for me to laugh at him when he loses. But that actually is kind of nice to know. That is kind of nice to know. Joseph Kennedy says, to be the man, you got to beat the man. That's indeed the case. Scotty Barnes, Bill Sanders talking about my penchant for only saying 5 more minutes and then staying here for 20. In this particular case, we can't do that. So 3 minutes from now, we're getting off the air. Yeah, normally we have a lot of flexibility. Today we do have, as the fancy broadcast folks say, we have a bit of a hard out today. Darius Brown says, let's all agree that of all the fan base, Ohio State is by far the worst, even more than Tennessee. Yeah, I do not believe the Ohio State fans are covering themselves in glory. But I tell you who's been worse than that, this Ohio State media bunch. Ohio State media has been terrible. They've been awful. And, listen, I make it very clear what I am. I've got, like, my Go for 2 and 22 T-shirt here on. Like, I am not trying to be like Johnny Objectivity. That's not what we're doing around here. I am doing a fan show for fans. Like, I make it very clear from the outset what I am. You get a lot of these other guys from, like, Columbus who are like, listen, I'm an objective journalist. And yet they sound worse than any fan whining about what they thought should have been a targeting call, even though they have been shown video evidence that proves that's not the case. Some of these so-called objective people from Columbus who still can't get over the hit on Bullard and Harrison. Like, I'm sorry your favorite player got hurt. I really am, but it's time to move on. I mean, it's not even the Ohio State fans that have been the worst to me. Some of their media people have been a disgrace, a absolute disgrace. Let's see what else. Okay, so Matt Rugavina's got more data here on Mattress Mac. He says he puts money on the Astros every single year, and he says we've won twice out of the last 5. So he definitely gets plenty wrong. Yeah, there you go. And listen, I love gambling and things like that, and obviously you couldn't have gambling if it wasn't sports books. But if the sports book thought Mattress Mac was going to win the bet, they wouldn't take the money. So that's all you kind of need to know right there on that. Jerry Popham says, I'm always going to value UGA round ball, and one thing stands out in particular, my one and only time to meet and speak with CVD happened at a basketball game. Yeah, Vince Dooley used to be at the basketball games all the time, and he had that one spot that was kind of like right behind the Georgia bench, probably about 5 or 6, maybe 7, 8 rows up. I used to see him there all the time too. And the thing about Vince Dooley, and obviously we're all excited about the Delta plane that's taking Georgia out there, that's got the Vince Dooley, tribute on the side of it. The thing about Dooley is he was a very accessible, famous person. Like, Dooley was a super famous guy. I mean, everybody in the sporting world kind of knew who Vince Dooley was. But you could just walk up to him and talk to him, and he'd tell you stories, and he'd do all that kind of stuff. I mean, you'll never see that again. That's not a bad thing. But, I mean, most of you will never meet Kirby Smart. I'm not saying anything bad about Kirby about that. It's just like, I mean, it's just like Kirby has sort of achieved a thing now that makes it almost impossible for him to be in public. In fact, I sort of hear some of the stories sometimes about just how challenging it is to sometimes even go see like your kids play sports or something like that. It's just hard to do. Like Vince Dooley was just kind of from a different era on that. And he was just a very accessible, famous person. A lot of you met him. A lot of you have good memories from the time you did get to meet him. And a basketball game was one of those places where you could do that. Also, the old Georgia coaches back then, Tubby Smith used to be really good about walking around and kind of greeting fans and saying thanks. Georgia basketball is a very different thing than Georgia football. Like, if you support Georgia basketball, they will thank you for your support because they need it and they're happy to have it. And so if you really want to feel a part of something, I would say the Georgia basketball program is kind of a good thing to get involved with because, listen, Georgia football is glad to have you too, but there's like 1 million people supporting Georgia football, and so it's easy to just kind of be kind of in the mix there. But if you step up and support Georgia basketball, especially at the start of the Mike White era here, I think you'll really feel like you're a part of it because they're going to be really, really grateful for that. Chris Slim White says, I'm using the whole 5 minutes talking. I don't think that's true, Chris. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's the case. Grateful Dog at DawgNation.com says Dugan's a gamer just like Stetson Bennett is. I do think there's some similarities. He says in the biggest moments he delivers, Dogs will have to dominate with physicality and make sure he stays contained. If Bennett stays within himself and follows the game plan, we should be in a good position to win, shootout or not. Yeah, I mean, look, I get what you're saying, and I don't disagree, but I do think job one for both sides of the ball, we're going to talk more about this in tomorrow's show, job one is you got to stop that shootout from happening. Because when you get into a shootout, everybody loses control. And the key for Georgian games like this, as the more talented team, as the better team, you got to maintain that control. You got to maintain that grip on the game. Ohio State had a pretty sizable lead against Georgia, but the game was being played at such a pace, even though that was the pace they typically play at, the game was being played at such a pace they could not maintain that control. So for Georgia on Monday night, I believe the job is to avoid all of that. Y'all have a great day. We will obviously see you back here tomorrow. Don't forget, check out the AJC. More of the stuff on the tailgating thing. This may be a really good reason to go to AJC.com. More of the stuff on the tailgating thing, what you can do, what you can't do in Los Angeles. They've got you on that. They've also got a bunch of folks heading out to L.A. too. So they'll get you plenty of coverage from the national championship game. Also, R.S. Andrews. Find them online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They will show up on time. They'll do the work that's promised, the price is promised. Water heater, if yours goes out, in many cases, R.S. Andrews can replace it for you the same day. You just got to find them online at rsandrews.com. You'll have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp. We will look forward to talking to you then.